Hello everybody, and welcome to the first part of the anatomy series. In this series, we're going to start each episode out by discussing some sort of fundamental technique in perspective, and then showing how that's going to apply to understanding the anatomy of the human body. Today's lesson will cover the anatomy of the head and neck, and since the skull is one of the most complex bone structures of the body, I thought it appropriate to start by discussing how we can rotate complex curves in perspective. So I'm going to begin by placing in a flat plane, and within that, I'm going to place a curve. I'm going to delineate these three edges A, B, and C, and that vertice, C, which we're going to rotate around. When I rotate this whole plane counterclockwise, what we notice is that A slopes towards us more and more, and B, being more visually close to us, is larger. Since we know that the curve has to touch each corner vertex, we can keep turning the plane towards us and map out that curve accordingly. Once you have the capacity to turn these planes in perspective, it's not too hard to create a line that goes from corner to corner. If you're having trouble rotating planes in perspective, be sure to check out my first Gumroad video, the fundamentals of dynamic sketching. Alright, so I want to establish a few pieces of nomenclature. So anytime that we have an axis that runs from the back of the skull to the front of the skull, that's known as our sagittal plane, and that has a minor axis going from left to right. Our axial plane has a minor axis that goes straight up and down, and our coronal plane goes from ear to ear and has a minor axis that goes from the front to the back. We can use these axes in conjunction with each other to make an accurate three-dimensional representation of the skull. Here I'm creating my axial plane with that vertical minor axis, a sagittal cut, and our coronal cut. When we combine those together, we can create a three-dimensional form that's a combination of all three. It's important to understand that the silhouette is actually going to be a combination of those three curves, as I mentioned. It's not going to be one or the other, which is a mistake I see students do all the time. Another way to look at this is that as we transition from a side to a front view, we're slowly blending the two curves together. At the two extremes, the profile and front view, the silhouette is determined exclusively by that one curve. In the previous version of this video, I go and do an exploded view of the skull, which is really great because you can see how each of these bones articulate with one another. There are many more bones to the skull than you'd probably think, so it's really good to study this and just figure out how this thing is constructed. Alright, notice as I rotate this clockwise, we're seeing more of that coronal view. The ellipses on the eye sockets start to increase in their degree. Now we'll do another step in that rotation. The coronal view is predominating the silhouette more and more as we continue to rotate. And the degree of those ellipses in the eye sockets is getting wider, as well as on the nasal bone. You can use certain elements like the sutures in between the skull bones to help indicate your minor axis and figure out some of the perspective. That far socket is now coming more and more into full view. Again, I use those sutures on the zygomatic bone to help figure out the perspective, and I kind of use it as a cylinder with a minor axis and an ellipse degree. And now we're getting in full front view, and the entire silhouette is dictated by the coronal view. The bottom edge of the maxilla, which is the bone that has the top row of teeth, you can use that as an axial ellipse with a vertical minor axis. So a lot of this is trying to find elements within the bone structure that allow you to see and visualize the perspective. Alright, so now let's take a deeper look at the bone structure of the skull. I'm going to start with just a front and side view. You can see that the frontal bone, the one that's creating the forehead, actually goes into the eye socket. It also has this coronal tapering in at the temple. On the lateral side of the eye socket, the frontal bone has a process that connects with the zygomatic, completing that circle that encases the eye, and then connecting that to the cheekbone. This zygomatic connects back to the temporal bone on the side of the skull via a process that juts out from the side of it. Underneath this loop that's created by the zygomatic and the temporal bone is the mandible, which is the bottom part of the jaw. And then connecting back into the base of the skull in the occipital bone is the top of cervical spine. A point that a lot of people tend to miss is this hyoid bone, which is floating directly in front of the cervical spine. And that acts as the origin point for the mylohyoid muscle, which connects to the chin. The reason why this is important is because there's actually a slope between the neck and jawline. And despite the fact that there's a tendency for us to just simplify the jaw to one solid line, it's actually a lot smoother and a softer curve. You'll be made more aware of this when we start adding musculature over the bony structure. Another important point is how much twisting and overlap there is with each bone. I'll do some form twisting in just a moment so we can devise some strategies of how to do this in perspective. But until then, let's take a look at the front view. You can see with this gesture already that the skull is longer than it is wide. That frontal bone that creates the forehead and the top part of the eye socket tapers in towards the temple. Here you can see that the eye socket is almost an extruded in cylinder of the frontal bone. The bridge of the nose, also known as the glabella, slopes inwards towards the center of the skull. The maxilla, or the bone that creates most of the muzzle, has a form that's similar to a rounded cylinder that has a much narrower top face than the bottom face. From this view, you can also see the gaps between the maxilla and the mandible, as well as the insertion of the mandible underneath that arch created by the zygomatic and temporal bones. There are a lot of internal structures within this nasal cavity that I'm not really going into right now. If you're interested in that, just look up some anatomy reference online, maybe more medical anatomy. I use a plethora of resources when I'm doing these videos, but one of them that I really like for anatomy is this biodigital website, which gives you a 3D model of the human body and allows you to remove or add specific bones and muscles. It's really great for developing your three-dimensional understanding of these structures. Alright, so let's label these bones just so we can have an idea of where each one is. The frontal, as I mentioned, making up the forehead, the parietal on the top and sides of the head, the occipital on the back of the skull, and the temporal on the lower sides of the skull. That nasal bone that forms the bony structure of the nose conjoins with the frontal bone and the maxilla. The zygomatic forms the majority of the cheekbone, and it connects to the temporal, frontal, and maxilla. The mandible, as mentioned, creates the lower jaw and inserts underneath the zygomatic and temporal bones. Radiating laterally from the sternum are the S-shaped clavicle bones. These bones connect to the acromion process on the scapula and the sternum, and they complete the shoulder girdle, which wraps around the upper part of the rib cage. Although it won't be discussed in this video, the clavicles will rotate along with the scapula to facilitate arm movement. There are 7 cervical vertebrae that make up the neck, and they have a concave curvature that's referred to as a lordosis. So you can add cervical lordosis to your list of medical terms that you can try to impress your friends with. Or just forget about it entirely and just remember that there are 7 vertebrae with a concavity to them. Okay, now let's recreate these structures in front view. Attached to the front of the ribcage is the manubrium, or the top of the sternum. And here emerging laterally is the S-shaped clavicles, as I mentioned previously. Here are the 2 scapula that float above the back of the ribcage, and their acromion process sticks out and connects to the lateral part of the clavicles, completing that circle that encases the ribcage. The first rib, or the top of the ribcage, connects to the manubrium as well, just beneath the clavicles. So you can see that these structures are somewhat interwoven and connected in a pretty complex manner. There are some processes on the lateral side of each vertebrae that connect one to another. I'm just sort of indicating that loosely here. And as mentioned, cervical vertebrae, which there is C1 through C7. I'm going to orbit the camera behind the skull at a 3/4 view and then bring it down so that we can see the connection between the spine and the occipital bone, as well as the arch created by the zygomatic and temporal bones. I'm simplifying the spine to a curved cylinder, and remember that from this perspective, since the skull is above us, each of those ellipses is going to be curving upward. This little bony structure that I just drew in on the temporal bone is known as the mastoid process, which is important because it acts as the insertion point for the sternocleidomastoid muscle on the neck. Here you can see the top portion of the mandible inserting underneath that zygomatic bone. And then the maxilla jutting forward. Always remember your perspective. That bottom edge of the mandible is connecting back towards that left vanishing point, and since we're looking up at it, we can see to that far side as well. From this angle, we can also see the back sides of the teeth, which is creating that far edge of the upwards facing ellipse of the maxilla. And here we see the frontal bone protruding forward, creating that process which will connect to the zygomatic. Notice how much space is in between these bones. There's really a lot of elements that need to fit in there. Fat, muscle, the eyes. Here I'm just hatching to show some of the curvature of the bone. And now I'm just going to place in those cervical vertebrae. I'm starting with the spinous processes, which jut backwards. I'm simplifying their structure quite a bit. If you want to get a little bit more of an accurate view of this, you can take a look at those 3D models or a reference book. There's pretty much an infinite level of detail when studying these things, so you have to know when to cut it off. Otherwise, you'll go down a rabbit hole of studying bones and joints, and you don't want to do that. Notice that I'm using hatching to show when one form is overlapping another or when one is in shadow. I'm using it to demonstrate that we're seeing the backside of a lot of these bones. Can really help create that separation. And the opening in which the spine inserts into the skull is known as the foramen magnum. Foramen is just another word for hole within a bone. Alright, now I'm drawing the skull in a 3/4 view. You notice that I place in those suture lines because they act as cross sections or ellipses that give me perspective. Same with the eye sockets or any of the other bony sutures. This point about overlapping bone is really important too. You see here how the frontal bone twists so that it can create the inner portion of the eye socket. We can see that same twisting here as the lateral process of the maxilla twists into the bottom form. I'm using line weight and hatching to show that those forms are twisting. You need to make sure that the viewer can understand exactly what's happening as they look at this. You can also see that twisting here on the mandible as that front edge twists into the bottom row of teeth. And the teeth are going to follow along that elliptical path that I've indicated. And now from this view, since we're looking down at the spine, that ellipse is going to curve downward. So I want to demonstrate that twisting just with a simple plane. You can see here that if I take this flat plane and apply a twist to it, it creates this S-shaped curve. In this new orientation, the bottom left vertex now connects to the top right, and the bottom right to the top left. If I fold the plane over so that it creates an arch, we can see that back edge. These two techniques will be invaluable when trying to replicate the curvature of bone. Let's talk a bit about the proportions and form breakdowns that we can use for the head. Will Weston has some really great examples of this on his Instagram at instagram.com/willwestonstudio. The major points that I've gathered from this is that he breaks down the head and neck into fourths, with the sternum being our origin, 1/4 up being our chin, 1/2 the base of the nose, at 3/4 the brow ridge, and the top of the head at 1. I'm simplifying those complex curves of the frontal and zygomatic bones into wedges that are extruded inward for the top portion of the eye socket and outward for the bottom portion. This will be a little bit more apparent when we do this in a perspective view. As far as the width of the head, it's roughly 5 eyes wide, which you can find by creating your eye shape within the eye socket and then expanding that out 5 times. But again, these are just generalizations, and real-life anatomy is going to have a great deal of variety within it. As I mentioned before, the head is longer than it is wide. I'm using this rounded and tilted primitive shape, which I'll show you how to expand in perspective in just a moment, with a vertical line for the mandible emerging about halfway back. So let's talk a little bit about how we can make that complex cranium structure in perspective. I'm starting out just by creating a regular rectangular prism in perspective, and what I'm going to do is draw through that and round out each of those edges. All I'm doing is taking each of those vertices and creating a slope. Now I can create that form with those rounded edges. And next I'm going to bevel each edge. So I'm taking those outer edges and turning them from 1 into 2. Essentially, I'm just repeating that shape, just a little bit smaller. And now I've created a beveled edge. It's important to realize that anytime we're using primitive forms to block things out, we're just using it as a means to understand the perspective. We're taking something that's very complex and has a lot of curvature to it and simplifying it to a basic form. What this means is that we can use any primitive form that we please, and we can modify them to however we see fit. So as you go through the anatomy series, don't feel as though you need to use the exact same forms that I'm using or that you need to follow them to a T. You might find ones that work better for you and some that allow you to understand the perspective better. And what I'll do from here is take that form and tilt it up so it's on a slant. Those bottom edges are tilting up towards the right side. So even though those edges are on a slant, every edge that's going back towards the right vanishing point is still in line going towards that right vanishing point. All of those edges that were going towards the left are now converging towards a new vanishing point that's below the page. and below the horizon line. These edges in blue are indicating the ground plane. Another common mistake that I see is pasting on the features of the face as if they're stickers sticking to a flat surface, while in actuality, these features are extrusions into a curved surface, so they're much more complex than just simple pasted features. I'm repeating that form breakdown that we saw in the initial front view, except now we're doing this in perspective. These forms are just representative of the front of the face, not the rest of the head. Notice that I use tilted planes and ellipses to help create that volume and form. I'll repeat the same thing but at a different angle. That brow pinches in and then extrudes outwards for the cheekbone. This will be a lot easier if you understand how your ellipses work and your minor axes do. So now what I'm going to do, in a very light line weight, I'm going to start by placing in those primitive forms that I just discussed earlier, and then in a heavier line weight, I'll place in my final details and complex curves that are more reminiscent of the actual anatomy of the skull. Remember to study those dynamic sketching techniques. You can always modify your primitive forms. For example, I created this tapering effect in the front edge of the mandible. Now I'm placing in those wedges for the frontal bone and the zygomatic. Those curves for the eye socket, which again are an extrusion into the structure. Some forms for the zygomatic bone. And I'm going to break the silhouette of the form with the maxilla. Remember that the form is just there to help orient ourselves in three-dimensional space. We don't need to follow it to a T. I can add on to my primitive form. Here I'm creating a coronal curve which I'll connect back to the silhouette of the frontal bone, and I'll use that to round out the remainder of the cranium. As far as line quality goes, using hatching and cast shadows will really help sell the volume of the form. Be sure to study things like Scott Robertson's How to Render in order to figure out how to cast shadows. Now I'm going to do the skull from a back view. I'm going to start by placing in that tilted primitive form. I didn't place in the beveling just because I didn't feel like it, but feel free to do so if you want. The skull here is at about eye level, and you can tell this because the top edges are pretty much flat. Once again, I'm adding on that coronal curve from ear to ear, which is allowing me to build out that form. Curving out that wedge shape for the zygomatic bone. And here we see the mandible, which we can actually see both sides of it from this angle. That process from the temporal bone is connecting to the zygomatic in the front, creating a little bit of a curve or an arch. Keep studying those and use 3D models for reference. I'm going to place in that curved cylinder for the spinal column. It's super important that you understand how ellipses and cylinders work, so really be sure to go back to that Fundamentals of Dynamic Sketching video or refer to some other resources like Scott Robertson's How to Draw. Remember that your goal shouldn't just be to understand how it works, but to be able to manipulate it and use it and intuit it. Alright, now I'm going to show you how I go about blocking in the shoulder girdle. This is probably one of the most important points, but basically I take a flat shape that I place within a rectangular plane. I'm then going to take that plane and rotate it into perspective, and find that same exact shape within it. Again, you can be really precise with how you duplicate these curves, and How to Draw has a lot of chapters on it, but the more you do it, the less you'll need to rely on those guidelines. So now in a light line way, I'm going to place in that same shape and perspective, and then I'm going to build out some of the more organic looking curves that are reminiscent of the actual bony structure. Here's the clavicle on the far side, the manubrium, and the clavicle on the closer side. From there we have the acromion process coming from the scapula on the back, the first rib, and the spinal column, which again is very important to understand how those ellipses work, because we can just simplify that to a curved cylinder. If you haven't realized by now, I think ellipses are very important. And now the body of the rib cage coming down with a vertical minor axis. And now I'm just indicating those minor axes for those elliptical features, like the spine and the glenohumeral joint there and the scapula. Let's have a closer look at the muscles of the neck. Here I'm just starting by gesturing in the skeletal elements. A circle for the skull, that curved cylinder for the vertebrae, and that custom shape for the shoulder girdle. And here I'm placing in a wedge shape for the mandible. The first rib of the rib cage is at an angle, so remember that its minor axis is going to be sloped. So over this initial shape block out, I'm just placing in the curves that are more reminiscent of the actual anatomy. But you can see once you have those forms in place, it's not too hard to follow along with it. Alright, here's the body of the sternum, and I happened to draw that skull earlier, so I just copied and pasted it. And now we're going to start placing in the muscles. In this red cylinder, I'm including all the intrinsic muscles of the neck as well as the trachea, and here in blue, I'm drawing in the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which lies on top. The next muscle I'm going to include is the trapezius, which attaches to the clavicle and the scapula and the base of the skull. And here in red again is those intrinsic muscles plus the trachea. In just a moment, we'll take a look at the range of motion of the neck and how each of these muscles can act to create movement within the bone structure. Now we'll look at those muscles from a back view. Again, placing in that shape for the clavicle and for the scapula. And now I'm just drawing over in a heavier line weight to make it resemble the anatomy. Here again in red are the intrinsics. Now in green you can see the trapezius coming from the center of the back, around the scapula and to the base of the neck. And then coming from the sternum and the clavicle and reaching to those mastoid processes on the back of the skull is the sternocleidomastoid. I mentioned earlier that there's that hyoid bone that floats in front of the skull. From that point to the base of the chin is a muscle called the mylohyoid, and that's what creates that slope from the chin to the neck. As promised, we'll take a look at the range of motion of the neck. I'll mention the role of each muscle we discussed so far in producing these movements. So first we'll view the head arching back. In this case, the head is tilted back, so we're going to be seeing the underside of the nose. All of those elliptical forms are going to slope upwards. And this motion is being produced by flexion of the trapezius muscle on the back of the head and on the neck. We can see the trachea and mylohyoid sticking out there, which is why I left that contour line in there. Okay, now the head is going to be pulled forward. In this instance, that is produced by flexion of both sternocleidomastoids on either side. In this case, the trapezius relaxes and allows the head to tilt forward. In this instance, the head is going to be tilted to the left. This is produced by a combination of the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. Rotation of the head to one side or the other is produced by flexion of the opposite sternocleidomastoid. So in order to rotate the head to the right, the left sternocleidomastoid must be flexed. The opposite sternocleido will relax. Now we can repeat all of these from the back view. In this case, with the head tilted back, you're going to see a little bit of folding of the skin behind the head. And you'll get a passive stretching of those sternocleidomastoids. In this case, you'll see the trapezius from the back view being stretched passively. And here you'll see that trapezius being stretched on one side and not the other. And in this case, since the head is turned to the left, we'll see relaxation of that left sternocleidomastoid and flexion on the right side. Let me show you some of the form simplifications that I use for understanding the neck. Sometimes I'll simplify the intrinsic muscles of the neck to this extruded trapezoid shape that has a bit of a slope towards the pit of the neck. I like to use this shape because I think it's a good accommodation for the trachea and some of the intrinsic muscles of the neck. Lengthening the cross-section of the neck in the back is the trapezius muscle, which then comes down in slopes on the sides. And the cylindrical sternocleidomastoid starts in the back of the neck and traverses towards the front of the sternum. Its shape tends to flatten out as it progresses towards the bottom of the neck. Remember that you can define any shape in perspective, so long as you understand its cross-sections. Alright, and I'll repeat this form breakdown in reverse just so you can get an idea of how it looks from behind. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the cartilages and muscles of the face. The structures of the ear and nose are formed by cartilages that have those characteristic shapes. I'll be doing a future video on facial expressions and different characteristics of faces, so I won't be going too in depth on the movements of the facial muscles today, but I'll give you a rough overview of their placement and function. So placed within the eye socket is the orbicularis oculi muscle, which acts to open up and close the eye, and it forms that characteristic eyelid. Surrounding the mouth and forming the structure of the lips is the orbicularis oris. On top of the cheekbones is the zygomaticus major and minor muscles, which act to elevate the top lip. Here next to the nose and on top of the nose are the nasal muscles, which act both to elevate the lip as well as to flare out the nostrils. The frontalis muscle, which acts to elevate the eyebrows and takes up a majority of the forehead. Here in pink are the depressor muscles of the lip, which act to lower the lower lip. The masseter muscle, which acts to close the jaw. Here in red are the temporal muscles, which lie on the side of the head, and they act to protect the temporal region of the skull, as well as contribute to some functioning of closing the mouth. Here on the back of the skull is the occipitalis muscle, which acts to just move some of the skin on the back of the head. And then here in yellow, the aforementioned mylohyoid. Do your best to memorize these muscles. I think over time the names and placements will become familiar to you, and it will be a lot easier to recall them when sketching without having to think too much about it. So let's try to take everything that we've done and put it together. I'm starting by just gesturing in that shape of the skull, and then figuring out some of the more specific features as I go on. If you refer to the original version of this video, I talk about something where I compare the level of the eye and the ear, and that usually helps me figure out where my perspective is and where my camera is in relation to the character. So for example, in this second face, you notice that the ears are located much higher up than the eyes, which means that our camera is positioned above looking down. Whereas here in the first and third character, the ear is near to the same level as the eyes, so the camera is at eye level with them. Once again, the camera's positioned pretty high up, so those ears are going to be much further up. Getting those shapes of the musculature and that trapezius. Now that the camera's positioned beneath the character, the ears are located lower than the eyes. Alright guys, that's just about it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to get access to all of the future Gumroad videos for just $5 a month, you can subscribe on Patreon. And we have a lot of really cool options like group lessons, one-on-one lessons, so be sure to check it out. Alright guys, thank you so much and take care.